Hi, everyone. I'm Kathy Neufeld-Dunn, one of the Associate Conference Ministers of Western District Conference. We're a part of Mennonite Church USA. I welcome you to Healthy Boundaries, what your minister is learning and what you need to know. Ever wonder what your pastor is learning at a Healthy Boundaries training? Why does my area conference require this training for our pastors? They don't require any other trainings. Why are boundaries so important anyway? I'll answer these questions and others in this video. This video will help you understand the importance of boundaries for your pastor. You can use it to help start a conversation about norms, expectations, and behaviors that are needed for each member of your faith community to create a healthy environment for all church participants. And I will define power and vulnerability, so all in your church will have a common language to share when analyzing specific challenging situations. When you look at these three photos on the screen, especially with boundaries in mind, what comes to mind? How do you feel about boundaries? Are they helpful or not? Why or why not? If you're watching this video with others, you should feel free to pause the video now to address these questions. Again, what comes to mind when you think about boundaries as you look at these three photos? How do you feel about boundaries? And are they helpful or not? And why? Please pause the video now. The wide open field may be a sign of freedom and joy for some of you, or it may seem a bit unnerving. A lack of boundaries can seem like freedom to some and a fearful situation to others. The flowers growing through the fence are an image of a porous border or boundary. The stone wall is a metaphor of a boundary that isn't flexible at all. So what do we mean by boundaries? Boundaries create space in relationships, from the most intimate to the most casual. Think about a friendship you have. Do you remember a situation that caused that friendship to grow deeper or caused confusion in the relationship? Occasionally, boundaries in relationships need to be tended. They may need to be clarified, renegotiated, or changed altogether. When we tend to the boundaries in any relationship, trust grows, and so does an appropriate level of intimacy. Think about your friendship at a deeper level. Is this the kind of friendship where you can call up your friend at any time, day or night? If not, do you have a sense of how late is too late? That is a time boundary. It's unspoken most of the time, but it's there. Is this the kind of relationship where you can talk quite deeply about family, faith, or even finances? Or do you stick to more casual topics like what you did on vacation, how your local sports team is doing, or the price of gas, or the weather? This is an emotional boundary you've drawn in this relationship. Do you hug your friend, or touch their shoulder, shake hands, or just smile at them? Or wave? Has the amount of physical contact changed through the years? This represents a physical boundary in that friendship. Now let's think about boundaries in your congregation. A big part of belonging to a faith community is about being in relationship with other people who are also active there, right? Sometimes boundaries are viewed as barriers to authentic relationships, when in fact boundaries can help refine and strengthen them in ways that are appropriate and safe. Here's an example. I have a dear friend, not in my church community in this case, who is hyper alert to physical touch. So though we're close friends, I don't come up behind her and touch her shoulder, because I know that triggers fear in her, and we've only shared a hug a handful of times. Because I care deeply about my friend and want her to feel safe around me, we maintain specific physical boundaries while maintaining more intimate emotional boundaries of deep conversation. Now let's return to the church context. Well, that photo is one example of a church context of a boundary, but let's look at other kinds of boundaries. What kind of boundaries have you observed in your own congregation? Have you noticed that doors are locked in your church building for security reasons at certain times? Maybe you've seen a child being accompanied to the bathroom by two adults. That's a boundary or best practice that protects a child from sexual abuse and protects church volunteers from allegations of abuse. Do you know which day your pastor takes off? Does your pastor answer non-emergency phone calls, texts, or emails on that day or not? Many pastors do not, drawing this kind of communication boundary to protect their Sabbath for a time of rest and rejuvenation. If you're watching this video with others, you may want to pause the video now to describe other boundaries you've noticed in your church community. What is the purpose of the boundary that you are highlighting? Do you agree or disagree that this particular boundary is a gift to the faith community or not? And why or why not? Again, the question is, what is the boundary that you're highlighting? Do you consider it useful or a gift or not? And why or why not? Pause the video at this time. Ultimately, we want our congregations to be places where boundaries help facilitate relationships and to keep us all healthy and safer together. We want our churches to be places where our own vulnerabilities are expressed with a hope of healing, not creating harm. What could possibly go wrong in church? Why are we so concerned about boundaries? I'm going to tell you a few brief stories. All of them are true. They all happened. A youth pastor invites a 15-year-old boy over to his house. He offers the youth alcohol, shows him porn, then sexually assaults the boy. A pastor who was recently divorced becomes romantically involved with two people from church at the same time. She had been counseling both of them prior to this. The chair of the board of trustees, who is also a major donor to the church, comes on to the new associate minister sexually. The pastor is viewing pornography on the church computer and uses the church credit card to pay for it. An adult youth sponsor is sexting with a youth in the church youth group. An usher responsible for collecting the offering in the church balcony pockets some of the cash on the way down the stairs each time. These all happened, and they all wreaked havoc in the churches where they occurred. Even though these stories make us wince, they highlight the importance of healthy boundary training, not only for pastors, but for other church members as well. That's why it's so important for ministers and other active church participants to have discussions about healthy boundaries in their congregations. When someone violates boundaries and these violations are ignored, this changes the culture of the congregation. The church changes from a place of trust to one of secrecy and distrust. Such a church also allows victimization and exploitation of vulnerable people to continue. Then, instead of growing faith, faith is eroded because the faith community is ignoring its foundational values and morals. On the other hand, when pastors and congregational leaders share responsibility, for fostering faithful, appropriate relationships, faith communities are safer places. They're places of accountability and trust. In short, healthy churches are the kind of places people want and need them to be. Now I'm going to introduce some of the main topics that we share with credentialed ministers in all Healthy Boundaries trainings. Boundary crossing versus boundary violation. We spend significant time in a Healthy Boundaries training distinguishing between boundary crossings and boundary violations. Boundary crossings are a fact of life. They are neutral activities that are a necessary part of any pastor's normal role in connecting with his or her or their people. Communication, touch, and emotional intimacy are all boundary crossings that are a part of a pastor's valid vocation. For example, a pastor regularly needs to call church people to set up meetings or to discuss church business. A pastor may shake hands or touch the shoulder of a church member. A pastor expresses sadness at a church member's death or the death of their loved one. These are examples of boundary crossings that are appropriate for pastors to do and are in the best interests of the individual and of the whole congregation. Boundary violations, on the other hand, are inappropriate and are not in the best interests of the other person, and potentially the whole congregation is harmed. Let's return to the examples that I shared a moment ago. The pastor makes a phone call. Instead of talking about church board agenda, the pastor talks about how the church board chair drives him nuts with his inability to run a smooth meeting. He's all over the place all the time, never sticks to the agenda, the pastor complains. When this remark gets out to the rest of the congregation, and it will, the pastor will have harmed the relationship with the person that he complained to, the person he complained about, and with many others in the congregation, if not the whole church. In our boundary crossing example, the pastor shakes hands with the person as he greets them in their home. It becomes a boundary violation if the pastor shakes hands while holding the shoulder of the person at the same time, intentionally or unintentionally, not allowing the person to break off physical contact on their own terms. If the handshake turns into a full frontal hug, well, that can be very confusing to the one who receives the hug. They might be thinking, does my pastor really like me? I mean, really like me? That's not okay. That leads to confusion. But what if the person the pastor hugged has had a history of sexual abuse? How would they receive the hug that they did not initiate? Bottom line, we don't know how any given person will receive a hug that they didn't initiate. We don't know if it will trigger bad memories or not. We just don't know. So we offer each other a choice. Would you welcome a hug, a handshake, a smile, a wave, or nothing today? What about expressing sadness about the loss of someone in the congregation or a congregant's family members? That's appropriate. But turning the conversation to your own experiences of grief and making the conversation about you is not okay. And it is not for the benefit of the church member and may in fact be harmful to them. Power and vulnerability. Power and vulnerability both exist between ministers and members of the congregation. Power is not wrong in and of itself. Power is a neutral thing. One way to understand power is to ask, who has the most resources in this situation? The person with the most resources is, of course, the more powerful one. When we define power in this way, we recognize that power and vulnerability are relative and change with the specific context. Generally speaking, a minister has more power in the context of the church because the minister comes with more education, more biblical knowledge, a role that encourages that person to preach, thus having the power to influence conversation or communicate specific views, as well as a role which demands emotional and spiritually intimate conversation with church participants. At other times, however, another church member may have more power. The church member may, for instance, have the ability to propose salary guidelines and adjust a pastor's salary up or down. In another situation, a pastor may choose to visit a grieving church member, only to be sexually harassed or assaulted. Power is about the resources each person brings to bear on that relationship and that particular context. Whoever has the most resources in that situation has the most power at that time. Understanding the realities of power and vulnerability in a faith community is fundamental to addressing healthy boundaries between ministers and people they minister with. When ministers violate boundaries, it is a misuse or abuse of power. When we don't have a common language or understanding of the concepts of power and vulnerability among the participants of a church, it is difficult for that faith community to identify and name a troubling situation for what it really is, a misuse or abuse of power resulting from a boundary violation or violations. Ministers and self-care. Ministers are responsible to tend to their needs for care, companionship, and deep listening ears. It's also the responsibility of the minister to find ways to address these needs outside of the congregation. Absolutely, ministers need deep friendships, but having deep friendships inside the church leaves some feeling left out and like they don't have the same access to the pastor's time and energy than others do. Ministers each need intimacy. Dating and sexual intimacy exploration by unmarried ministers need to occur outside of the congregation. Otherwise, if the dating relationship should break up, how will the pastor ever navigate being just the minister, not the ex again? Ministers need to have time for rest and time to nurture other interests. It gives their life and ministry balance and ultimately contributes to the health of their ministry. They bring their best, healthier selves to the congregation. Ministers need to be able to name their needs, a recognized day off, time for a vacation or a spiritual retreat, and expect the congregation to recognize and affirm these needs too. If you're watching this video with others, or even by yourself, you're welcome to follow the link in the comments below or in the chat box if you're watching this on a Zoom call. Click on the file called What I Expect from My Faith Leader. Feel free to discuss, feel free to take time to fill out this quiz, and then feel free to discuss why you marked which expectations and perhaps what additional expectations you might have of your minister. As part of the healthy boundaries in your congregation, it's quite helpful to have a group within the congregation whose task it is to check in with the pastor about ministerial expectations at least once a year. This is essential during the early years of a new pastorate, or when there have been significant changes or challenges within the church or in society in general that might change ministry expectations for your pastor. A few examples might be a global pandemic or anxiety about decreasing church membership. Keep the lines of communication open between your pastor and active participants. Help unspoken expectations of your pastor to be spoken aloud and discussed together. All right, take a few moments to fill out what I expect from my faith leader, then come back. Here is a summary of the main concepts of any Healthy Boundaries training. Expectations. Clarify those pastoral expectations, which are often unspoken. So ask a wise group in the church to help you seek clarity about pastoral expectations, as I just noted. Otherwise, a minister may disappoint people without intending to, especially at the beginning of a new pastorate or when new members join the church, or, as I noted, in the midst of a crisis or extreme changes of a changing time. For example, a minister might want to ask about expectations. Will I be expected to attend church members' retirement parties, 50th anniversary receptions, or sporting events for youth? What are the congregation's expectations about these sorts of social engagements? It's only part of the conversation. Differing interpretations. Be aware of how the same reality can be interpreted in different ways. For instance, the nature of the pastoral relationship is that we listen and talk with our church member about important personal things. And pastors, unlike therapists, may from time to time talk about their own experiences with their church people. But boundary issues arise when this appropriately deep level of pastoral conversation is interpreted as a special mutual friendship. This changes the expectations for the church members. Healthy boundaries between a pastor and a church member are these. Pastors do not and should not have special mutual reciprocal friendships within the congregation because others will always feel left out. A healthy boundary for a pastor to remember is that the minister is always a minister first and foremost, even to the exclusion of other ways of relating. Pastors, of course, should be friendly. They should not expect to have close reciprocal friendships where they share their deep interior life with their church members. That's hard for some of us to hear, but it's incredibly important to recognize and to understand. Power differentials. Recognize that power is neutral. Power is about the resources we have to bear with any given situation. How we use our power for the good of others is the question. Reverend Glenna Shepherd puts it this way: the inherent nature of the pastoral relationship always involves a power differential. In order to be the best pastor I can be, I need to put limits or boundaries on the types of relationships I might have with a congregant. That means being attentive to what might lead to misinterpretations. Power and vulnerability are contextual. Again, who brings the most resources to any given situation? Is the pastor going to make a home visit? What kind of physical or touch-related boundaries would be most healthy in that situation? Hugs often have the potential to be misinterpreted, but especially in a home setting, especially if it is only the pastor and one church member present in the home. What if the pastor is a small female and the church member is a large male living by himself? Might the pastor choose a different location for the meeting to maintain healthy boundaries for both of them, such as a coffee shop or the public library? If you're watching this video with others, you are welcome to pause the video to discuss the following 2 case studies. These are a way to integrate some of the main topics in any Healthy Boundaries training. Case study A. Daniel has recently been coming to church in search of a new church home. He's found the new church friendly, maybe too friendly. The pastor and lay people greet him every Sunday with a big hug. He's kind of uncomfortable with these shows of affection. You see, he was sexually abused as a young teen by his youth minister. He likes the new pastor and the church, but he's not sure it's a good fit for him. What should Daniel do? What could the church do differently to help Daniel feel safe and welcome? Pause the video if you like to take time to discuss. Case study B. Suzanne's father owns a car dealership. Suzanne really likes her pastor and has noticed that he drives an older model car. She talks her father into giving the pastor a new car. The pastor appreciates her generosity, but declines the gift, even though he could use a new car. Why do you think the pastor declined the gift? How would you feel if you were in Suzanne's position? What kind of conversation could the church leadership have with the pastor to learn more about why he responded the way he did to the offered gift? Please pause the video now. If you're watching this video as an active participant in a Western District Conference, an area conference of Mennonite Church USA, you should be aware that WDC requires our credentialed ministers, whether they're licensed or ordained, to take Healthy Boundaries training 1 time every 3 years to retain an active license or ordination credential. When your pastor fulfills this requirement, they remain in good standing in Western District Conference. We offer the basic training, Healthy Boundaries 101, and the advanced training, Healthy Boundaries 201, online only at this time. We hope to be able to offer both of these trainings, both in person and online, in the near future. We pray that our credentialed ministers are integrating the skills and the knowledge that they learn during these trainings so they may minimize risking harm to others in their ministry settings and growing into the healthiest ministers that they can be. To close, I'd like to read a poem by William Ayet entitled "The Contract, a Word from the Lead." It describes essential aspects of good leadership from the perspectives of those whom they lead. And so, the contract, a word from the lead. And in the end, we follow them, not because we're paid, not because we might see some advantage, not because of the things they have accomplished, even because of the dreams they dream, but simply because of who they are. The man, the woman, the leader, the boss, standing up there when the wave hits the rock, passing out faith and confidence like life jackets, knowing the currents, holding the doubts, imagining the delights and terrors of every landfall, captain, pirate, and parent by turns, the bearer of our countless hopes and expectations. We give them our trust. We give them our effort. What we ask for in return is that they stay true. Thanks for listening. Please continue or begin a conversation about healthy boundaries now or with your congregation. God bless you all.